We begin my top 26 quarterback rankings with quarterbacks that I think are low in QB2s to high in threes. You have Cousins, Locke, Young, and Rush. So Kirk Cousins, when he's not playing Tampa Bay, has been one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL. Minnesota's defense knows him very well. They run a very confusing odd front defense where you never know where the pressure is coming from. I think they're going to give him a ton of trouble, and I think he is a must avoid unless you are desperate. Drew Lock, I think, is an underrated quarterback, but the offensive line around him is terrible. Uh, the skill position players are decent around him. Obviously, Malik Neighbors is good, but he really just doesn't have any time to get them the ball. And so I do think against the New Orleans Saints, who do allow the ninth fewest points to quarterbacks, that he's a must avoid. Bryce Young is playing against Philly this week. They do allow the fifth fewest points to quarterbacks. While he has looked like the number one overall pick the past couple of weeks, I think this is a must avoid matchup for him. I think their interior pass rush in particular is going to give him a ton of issue. Bryce Young is playing against Philly this week. I think their defensive line is going to give him a ton of issues. And while he has played really well and looked like the number one overall pick, I do think in this specific matchup, he is a must avoid. Cooper Rush is playing against Cincy. And so while they do allow some of the most points in the league to fantasy quarterbacks, I do think he's quite risky, and I would avoid him this week if you could. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are probably mid to low end quarterback twos. You have Aiden O'Connell, Derek Carr, Mac Jones, and A-Rod. So Aiden O'Connell's coming off a decent game, and he is playing against Tampa Bay. I do think he has some upside, but in terms of his talent at QB, I don't think he's a starting level quarterback. And so I do think there's a ton of risk, but there is also quite a bit of upside when you play Tampa Bay. Well, Derek Carr has lost all of the playmakers around him. I do think he's going to feature his tight ends heavily in this game, but I don't think he's going to have a particularly great day. Even against the New York Giants, who are better than average of a matchup, I still think he's a must avoid unless you're really desperate. In relief of Trevor Lawrence, Mac Jones looked pretty good this past week. Tennessee's defense is performing rather poorly since L'Jarius Sneed left with injury, and he's on IR now. But I still think that Mac Jones is a replacement, high-end backup level quarterback. And with the offensive line that's protecting him, I do think he's quite risky. And so if you can avoid him, I would, but he definitely does have some upside. Now we have Aaron Rodgers. So he's playing against Miami. They do allow the third fewest points to quarterbacks. He's been quite poor recently for us in fantasy, and so there's definitely some risk, but I do think he's going to be in an extremely pass-happy game script. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are mid QB2s to potentially high-end QB2s. You have Stafford, Love, Winston, Mahomes, Geno, and Will Levis. So Matt Stafford has been very good in terms of throwing touchdowns, but the yardage has been lacking, and he really doesn't provide any rushing upside. I do think he has a couple touchdowns in this game, but I also think he has a couple turnovers, which does make him a risky QB2. Now we have Jordan Love against Detroit. They do allow the seventh fewest points to quarterbacks, but I do think the game script is going to be in his favor. I think they're going to have to air out the ball quite a bit, and so I do think he's a solid QB2, but the matchup is quite tough, and I do think he has a couple turnovers. Now we have Jameis Winston against Pittsburgh. He did look decent considering the weather conditions against them 2 weeks ago, but Pittsburgh's defense does allow the fewest points to quarterbacks. We know he's going to sling it, but I do think he has a couple turnovers in this game, and so he is a little bit risky, especially considering he's unlikely to have the yardage output that he did this past week. Patrick Mahomes is playing against the Chargers this week. It is a rather tough matchup. They do allow the 10th fewest points to quarterbacks, but it is Patrick Mahomes. I think he throws a couple touchdowns in this game, but I don't think he has a massive day overall, making him a high-end QB2. Geno Smith has cooled off a little bit, but with everybody returning and playing in terms of the skill position players, and against Arizona, the game script probably being that he needs to pass quite a bit, I do think he's a high-end QB2 this week, but in better matchups, I'd have him as a QB1. And now we have Will Levis against Jacksonville. They do allow the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks. It's a great spot for him. I think he has a ton of upside, and he scored at least 15 fantasy points in each of the past 4 weeks. If you like what you're seeing and hearing so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. And make sure to check out my tight end rankings as well. They're dropping today. And make sure to check out my running back and wide receiver rankings as they're dropping on Friday. Thanks. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are mid to low end QB1s this week. You have Goff, Purdy, Wilson, Herbert, Darnold, and Murray. So Jared Goff is playing against Green Bay. They do allow the 6 fewest points to quarterbacks. I think he has a couple touchdowns this game, remains turnover free, and is a solid option as a low-end QB1. Brock Purdy is coming off a very poor performance, but a lot of that was due to the weather. Against Chicago, I do think he's going to find it a little bit easier than he did this past week due to the weather, but they do allow the second fewest points to quarterbacks. Like I said, I do think he has a bit of a bounce back week, but I don't think he has one of those elite QB1 weeks like we generally see from him in decent matchups. Russell Wilson absolutely torched the Bengals this past week. I do think, though, against Myles Garrett and the Browns, he's going to find it a little bit tougher, but I still think that he's a QB1, albeit a low-end QB1, and I do think he throws a couple touchdowns, but has a turnover. Now we have Justin Herbert. The past 2 weeks, he's cooled off a little bit, but Kansas City is a matchup that he should be able to exploit, and he should absolutely be needed in this game to keep up with Kansas City. I think the passing volume is absolutely there, and I think that Will Dissly has a decent game, but I think Ladd McConkey has an awesome game. Sam Darnold has been very consistent for us recently. I think that he has another solid game against Atlanta. They do allow some of the most points to quarterbacks for us in fantasy, and so I do think he's going to have a solid game with multiple touchdowns. Now we have Kyler Murray against Seattle. He did have only 10 points the last time they played. I do think he has a bit of a bounce back week, though, and I do think he scores a rushing touchdown. Now we have quarterbacks that I think are mid to elite QB1s, with a realistic shot at being the QB1 this week. You have Caleb Williams, Tua Tagovailoa, Baker Mayfield, Joe Burrow, Jalen Hurts, and Josh Allen. So Caleb Williams, since Thomas Brown has taken over the OC position, he's now the head coach, at least the interim one. He has been on a tear recently. I think that continues here against San Fran, at least compared to what we saw earlier from him. I think he throws multiple touchdowns and remains turnover free. He has only thrown 5 interceptions on the season. While he's played very poorly in some of these games, the lack of turnovers has been absolutely great to see. Tua Tagovailoa, after a bit of a slow start in his return from the concussion, has been on a tear recently. I think against the New York Jets, even though they allowed the 8th fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, that he is an absolute must start. He's been on a hot streak. He's been featuring Jonnu Smith immensely, and I do think he continues to be a QB1 for us in fantasy. Baker Mayfield has been on the decline in terms of his fantasy performances the past couple weeks. Las Vegas is absolutely a get-right matchup, though. I think he throws multiple touchdowns, including 2 to Mike Evans. Joe Burrow came back down to earth in terms of his fantasy output this past week. It was still decent, but before that, he had been on an absolute tear. I think he gets back on track here against Dallas. They are absolutely a matchup that he can exploit. I think he throws multiple touchdowns, including 1 to Chase and 1 to Higgins. Jalen Hurts is playing against the Panthers this week. He is obviously a must start. The Panthers are incapable of stopping just about anybody at quarterback. I think he's going to have a massive day, including a rushing touchdown. I bet you didn't think that Josh Allen was going to have a receiving touchdown this past week. I certainly didn't think so. Against the Rams, it is a little bit tougher of a matchup. They do allow the 13th fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks, but it's Josh Allen. I do think he scores on the ground, and I think he's going to have to pass the ball quite a bit so that they win this game. And to review, quarterbacks that I think are probably low in QB2s to high in QB3s, you have Cousins, Locke, Young, and Rush. Quarterbacks that I think are probably low in QB2s this week, you have O'Connell, Carr, Jones, and Rodgers. Quarterbacks that I think are probably in that mid to high in QB2 range, you have Stafford, Love, Winston, Mahomes, Smith, and Levis. Quarterbacks that I think are mid to low end QB1s this week, you have Goff, Purdy, Wilson, Herbert, Darnold, and Murray. And then QBs that I think are mid to elite QB1s with a realistic shot at being the QB1 this week, you have Caleb Williams, Tua Tagovailoa, Baker Mayfield, Joe Burrow, Jalen Hurts, and Josh Allen. All right, you know the drill. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. And make sure to check out my tight end rankings. They're coming out today as well. And make sure you check out my running back and wide receiver rankings, which are dropping tomorrow. Thanks.